All right. On to the second part of our lesson. We'll talk a little bit about, again, what we said in the last video was the importance of providence and the doctrine of election with Puritan writers like Bradstreet and others, and also some myths about Puritanism. Some of them you might find funny. But with those things in mind, let's examine two of her poems that are kind of a little bit more famous than some of the others. The first one here follows some verses upon the burning of our house, July 10th, 1666. A couple of things to set up the context of this. Of course, in that day and age, there was a big sort of division of labor within most households. Bradstreet and her husband would have been considered leaders in the community, would have been considered some of the more affluent people in the community. There's no question about it. He had a lot of business affairs where he was gone quite often, as you'll see in the next poem. But the primary way of looking at things was with this division of labor was to see men and women as having different spheres or different roles. The man worked outside of the house. He was responsible for earning the money. The woman's role was in the house, domestic duties, and many times it wasn't just cooking and cleaning. It was managing a household, especially if you had a staff. Now, in that day and age, you did not have to be a terribly wealthy person to have someone working for you in terms of a servant or two, or sometimes more. We don't know an awful lot about Bradstreet's servants, but it's unquestionable that she had servants. So she would have had to deal with all the finances. Think of it this way. Think of a household as being like a business, and the woman had to run that business. So she had to hire and fire people, and she had to budget, and she had to run everything. And frequently, if you, as so many people did, if you ran a business out of your household, it became even more important for the wife to be able to have that business savvy and that business sense. She was an accountant and a bookkeeper and all of those sorts of things. If you were a doctor or you were a dentist or you ran something, your offices would be in your house, right? I mean, you'd be doing like minor surgery in what we would consider the living room these days. Their houses were not terribly big. These are people who had just come over in just a couple of decades since settlement had begun. And the reason I bring all this to your attention is because the home was much more than just a house to a woman of her stature and at that time. It was a reflection of who she was. It was a reflection of her personality. It was her entire sort of being was wrapped up in this place. It was invested with a lot of memories and all those kinds of things. And you can see that, particularly on page 9 in the poem, a few lines down from the top of the page. The flame consumed my dwelling place, and when I could no longer look, I blessed his name that gave and took, that laid my goods now in the dust. Yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. It was his own, it was not mine. Right? The poem, in some measure, is an attempt to distance herself from this possession known as her home, but it's more than just a place. It's who she is. It's wrapped up in her identity as a person, as a woman, as a wife, as a mother. And so this is exceedingly hard. It's more than just losing a possession. It's losing your identity in some respects. And so when she recounts this, there's this strong idea here that this is something of value to me, but also it's something that I have to come to terms with. And she also acknowledges providence in that, when she says, I blessed his name that gave and took, that laid my goods now in the dust. Yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. It was his own, not mine. Right? So nothing I own in this world belongs to me. Everything belongs to God. I'm only loaned it for a while, lent it for a while. A little bit further down, my pleasant things in ashes lie, and them behold no more shall I. Under thy roof no guest shall sit, nor at thy table eat a bit. No pleasant talk shall e'er be told, not things recounted done of old. Nor no candle e'er shall shine in thee, nor bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. So this is not just a recounting of the things that she owned. It's a recounting of the things that had happened there or would have happened there had it not burned down. All these things, the times that we shared here, the friends that we had over for dinner, all of the special occasions and holidays and things where we had these memories. And she also looks forward and says, and we're not going to have anything there in the future. All those things that we had planned, holidays and weddings. Most people don't realize this, but the Puritans did not have weddings in churches. They considered them to be really secular covenants, blessed by God, but in no greater fashion largely than, say, some other kind of contract or agreement between people, but a little bit more, but not it wasn't some sort of religious ceremony that they had, but so they had them in homes, and that's what she's referring to. No bridegroom's voice shall e'er be heard. So in other words, her daughters won't be married there. They'll have to have another home. And so she had sort of envisioned when they built the house that all these things would happen, and it wouldn't. Towards the end, she says, by him who hath enough to do, a price so vast is as is unknown, yet by his gift is made thine own. There's wealth enough, I need no more. Farewell my pelf, farewell my store. Pelf means property. The world no longer let me love, my hope and treasure lies above. So the issue that we have with the poem is not to question her sincerity, but to try to untangle both the grief that is real versus the consolation she has in her religious beliefs. I don't doubt at all that she is focused on something greater, but there's still this underlying, very visible sense of pain and loss there. You can almost sense that she's saying, why did this happen to me? I don't understand what's going on. But that Puritan idea of providence, she really rests on that and says, I don't know why this happened, but it happened because it, number one, to teach me not to get too attached to things. Number two, to remind me that my store, my real home is in heaven. All of those things. But there's still this deep sense of sadness if you read between the lines of how she's really disappointed in what happened. It's a very human poem in that respect. Another very human poem, the one on her husband. Her relationship with her husband was one that we don't know an awful lot about, but we do know that it was a great relationship. They loved each other dearly. They wrote each other very often. He was away quite frequently, but they were very close to each other all their lives. And, of course, he predeceased her. But, there's a real sense here in this poem to my dear and loving husband of exactly what kind of relation. It's a very different kind of relation. It's not all romance and lovey-dovey and all that kind of stuff. It's a deeper spiritual kind of relationship. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if ye can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love but from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we love, in love let's so persevere, that when we live no more, we may live ever. She would have said persever. And ever, so it would have rhymed. This is an interesting poem because this is a deep, heartfelt profession of loyalty and love. You have to understand that, we'll talk more about this later on, that in the 17th century and for 2 centuries afterwards anyway, people primarily saw marriage as being kind of almost like a business deal, not quite, but you married for practical reasons as well as romantic reasons. If you got along and were attracted to each other, that's even better. But you did it for very practical reasons. The primary purpose of marriage, according to the Puritan religion and many other early Christian religions and other religions, was the production of children. And so if you were helping each other along the way in life and taking care of each other and thriving and having children, that was what marriage was for. It wasn't about some sort of spiritual fulfillment. But you see some of that in here. But she pulls back. This is very important. She pulls back. She does not place the marriage relationship ahead of her relationship with God. She does not invest it with that degree of significance. Notice what she says here. She prizes it more than whole mines of gold. It's more important than anything on earth to her. But look at these last lines. Then while we love, in love, let's so persevere. Okay, and notice that persevere. That's not a terribly romantic term. Let's persevere. Let's get through this, right? But that's what marriage was to a Puritan in large part, a way to get through life's trials and go on to the reward in heaven if you're of the elect. So while we love, notice she does not say that they will love each other on the same level in heaven. Here is here, there is there. Here we love each other as man and wife. In the other life, there will be another relationship that we might have, or not at all. Then while we love, that seems temporary, right? Earthly. In love, let's so persevere, that when we live no more, we may live ever. That when we die, we'll have everlasting life. Notice the purpose of the marriage is to get you to heaven in some way. Not because the spouse is a salvation, but a helper to get you there, right? But then after that, when you're in heaven, there's no talk of being married for eternity. Not at all. Quite an interesting thing. So you can see a little bit of there about the providence and the doctrine of election there in as kind of a witness. It's a very different way. It is both a touching poem that describes her relationship with her husband. It's very heartfelt, but she's not in some sort of dreamland where, he's everything to her. And she certainly is very cautious as a devout Puritan not to place too much value on the marriage relationship ahead of the relationship that she has with God. Marriage exists to get you through your life, to be supportive with somebody, to help each other out, to love each other, to care for each other. And then when you die, then it's over. Okay, it's over. That's replaced with a different kind of relationship. Now, she doesn't speak as to whether or not they would have any relationship in the afterlife, but she certainly doesn't focus on that as being an important aspect. Now let's switch gears for a second and take a look at Phillis Wheatley. Another first, in a way, just as Bradstreet was the first person to publish a book in the English language in the part of the United States would eventually become part of North America that would eventually become the United States. Phillis Wheatley is really the first published African American poet. Certainly, we know that poet. And of course, she's writing a little bit later, but I thought I would group these together because they're both firsts in a way, and they're kind of interesting, even though Wheatley's 100 years later and not a Puritan at all. And in your headnote, you can see a little bit about some of her biography. We don't know an awful lot. There's a lot of conjecture here. But it's an interesting poem because, like Bradstreet also, not only is she a first, but her notoriety was due in large part by her being, like Bradstreet, kind of an oddity to the readers of the day. It would have been very unusual to read something from an African American. They would have thought, the largely white audience, American and European, would have thought this is very strange, because it simply wasn't something that they read every day. They'd never read an African American writer or poet. Some people probably would have questioned it. We have to kind of question it a bit ourselves. That's another reason why I wanted to put these two together, because if we look at the prologue by Anne Bradstreet and say, what is she up to here? I wonder whether there's something subversive or ironic, or is it totally sincere? And this is a poem that gives us that same sort of problem before us. On being brought from Africa to America. It's a poem that kind of makes us a little bit uncomfortable in some ways, because we wonder how sincere she's being, or how subversive, or how submissive she's being. We don't know. It says, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." So when we read the poem, we think, okay, does she say she was, because what she's basically saying is I was blessed and fortunate to have been enslaved and brought from Africa. Maybe not the enslaved part, but the brought from Africa part for sure. Because had I not been, I would have continued to be a pagan, and because I was transported over here, I learned about Christianity, and now I'm a Christian, and this is salvation, and so on. Not sure she necessarily would believe in the slavery aspect of it, but it is in a way, kind of a shockingly positive attitude about being enslaved and transported to the New World. Something that's kind of a little unsettling. Now, some people would say, look, she doesn't really mean this. This is not sincere. She's actually protesting in some measure, because the last two lines, which we'll get to in a moment, clearly are a bit of a protest. Others would look at it and say, well, no, she's sincere in thinking this, but there's no criticism here of Christianity. There's an implicit criticism of slavery, but others then would say there really isn't any questioning at all of her status or her situation, because she was brought over just as a child and wouldn't have known any better. She was so young that she was brought up in a culture that essentially, I hate to use the word, brainwashed her into believing that this was her appropriate place. You'll have to decide. I do think, though, that the last line is critical. That she says, the last two lines, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain. Why Cain? Well, there was this odd belief among Europeans that Africans were descended from Cain. You know, when Cain killed Abel, he was given a mark, and this mark was the mark of Cain, was supposed to set him apart from anybody else, etc. And there were Europeans who, according to folklore, thought that that mark of Cain was dark pigmented skin. Now, never mind the fact that whatever descendants of Cain there really were only three descendants from the rest of us after the flood came, and Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah. So all the descendants of Cain, well, I don't know. That seems very odd to me that people never took that into account. I guess they didn't read that part of Genesis. But anyway, it's a folk tale. It's a folklore thing. Quasi-religious, and she uses it to say, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. This is an assertion of, at least on a spiritual level, equality, because what she's saying is, just remember, and what's in between the lines here is, remember what? Remember how to treat us, because we too will inherit a place in heaven, and we too will be there, and presumably, she doesn't say it because I don't think she can, we'll be equals there. You know, we may not be equals here, but we'll be equals there. So I think implicit in that is an argument that individuals should check their behavior. Anyway, it's a fairly assertive line there that I think gives some credence to the notion that perhaps she is thankful to have been converted to Christianity. I don't see in here a thankfulness of being a slave or enslaved. But it's an interesting poem because, like the Bradstreet poem, the prologue, it's got some interesting sort of verbal and argumentative and rhetorical things to it that make you think a little bit. Okay, let's talk about our first quiz. I'm going to ask you to answer these two quiz questions just in it. You don't have to write the questions. It's just in an email sent straight to me, to my Yahoo email address, and that's my Yahoo email address is in the syllabus there. Just submit your responses to the quiz below to my email, but no later than midnight on Tuesday, July the 9th. Number one, name two things Bradstreet laments about the loss of her home. What in the poem did you see? Things that she lamented losing. And number two, why does Wheatley say Negroes black as Cain? What is this a reference to? Okay? This is an easy quiz. If you listen to this lecture, you probably got it. Other quizzes might be a little bit more challenging, but I thought we'd start off with an easy one, all right? So send that to me, and I'll get more information to you a little bit later about Lesson 2, which is coming up on Wednesday.